Over time, the United States, Japan and Australia are likely to become less and less sympathetic to the passive approach by ASEAN and many of its member states. Refusing to focus on points of disagreement with China will not protect Southeast Asian, American and allied interests. Declining to take a strong stand is indeed an active and consequential decision when China is pushing, challenging and changing external rules and the strategic environment. Washington and its allies will seek to refute the logic and question the effectiveness of the Southeast Asian approach and assert themselves with or without ASEAN involvement or consent. An immediate target will be the COC process or even a concluded COC itself. Even if the COC is signed, there is little expectation it would rein in Chinese activity and no expectation that illegal Chinese gains will be reversed. As Chinese policies in the disputed areas have profound strategic and other implications for the entire region, the United States, Japan and Australia will become openly unaccepting of the perspective that disagreements in the South China Sea are primarily an ASEAN-China issue and only amenable to an ASEAN-China solution. Indeed, it is worth noting that only 5 of the 10 ASEAN states, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia and Brunei, are claimants. Although ASEAN is not a unified strategic entity, it does have the capacity to raise the diplomatic heat on countries through collective approbation, something it has refused to do against China. Several member states will grow increasingly frustrated with ASEAN's reluctance or else inability to voice greater disapproval of Chinese actions. The Philippines took its disputes to an arbitration tribunal convened under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea only for the Rodrigo Duterte government to downplay the favorable ruling. Vietnam and Indonesia have been more vocal than peers in criticizing Chinese behavior but have been unable to persuade ASEAN colleagues to follow their lead. Unlike his predecessor Najib Razak, one hopes Malaysia under Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad might well adopt a prickly approach toward China in defense of its own interests. Given ASEAN's inability to come to any consensus required to take a harder line vis-a-vis China, several anxious Southeast Asian states will eventually look beyond ASEAN when it comes to increasing diplomatic pressure and costs on China, assuming they are not prepared to quietly cede control of their maritime periphery and existing claims. The United States, Japan and Australia already have established and institutionalized dialogues. It would be a relatively easy matter to include willing Southeast Asian members in an ad hoc manner and issue collective or coordinated diplomatic statements against Chinese behavior. If India decided to commit more enthusiastically to the Quad, as the other 3 members have done, then a Quad-led response involving other Southeast Asian players could be considered. Bear in mind that the primary objective is not to precipitate the irrelevance of ASEAN and heighten the anxiety of relatively small and weak Southeast Asian states. But the twin arguments that ASEAN centrality ought to be uncontested and that Southeast Asian states must not be forced to choose between sides are no longer tenable. The centrality of an organization which refuses to respond when the strategic interests of its own members are being eroded in an ongoing and rapid manner cannot endure in the rough and tumble world of international politics. The usefulness of ASEAN's diplomatic centrality with respect to achieving strategic objectives will come under scrutiny from within and without. This is not a threat to be issued to ASEAN but a reality that ought to be brought to its attention. Moreover, Southeast Asian nations that believe there is a no-cost approach to China are living in a fool's paradise. Beijing has already built up enough military infrastructure with which to challenge the U.S. presence in the region and overwhelm the military forces of any other South China Sea claimants. According to the commander of Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Philip S. Davidson, it is difficult to see how that constitutes a no-cost, or even low-cost, approach to China. It is also worth reminding Southeast Asians that just as the grand strategy of the United States since the beginning of the previous century has been to prevent the emergence of a potentially hostile hegemon on either side of the Eurasian landmass. The grand objective of Asian maritime nations over the same period has been to prevent the emergence of another Asian hegemon in the region. Regional states might resent pressure being brought to bear against their Himalayan approaches, but a disengaged America is the worst of all outcomes. Iraqi restaurant pays tribute to Donald Trump. This is the reason why American preeminence was always, and remains, much preferred by Southeast Asia's own standard. The cost of the current approach ought to be already unacceptably high. Surely merely avoiding Chinese opprobrium is not the endgame when Beijing has illegally created and is in the process of militarizing 3,200 acres of land in the South China Sea over the past 5 years. Regional states should also be told in explicit terms that the price of regional passivity and willingness to bend the knee to China is fast becoming prohibitive for the United States and its allies. Southeast Asian states must choose wisely. Diplomatic messaging matters because failure to criticize Chinese actions and support U.S. policies and actions allows Beijing to legitimize illegal behavior, deflect criticism and broadcast the narrative of American weakness, lack of resolve and fading relevance. Beijing labels American actions such as its periodic freedom of navigation operations near Chinese-held land features as destabilizing and provocative when it is China's illegal behavior which is the revisionist challenge to international law and the status quo. China accuses the United States of sowing discord when the latter enhances its security networks in the region in response to Chinese assertiveness. This perverse logic is effective because it is uncontested and generally met with silence from Southeast Asia. One priority is to address paralysis resulting from the need to secure unanimity in ASEAN's decision-making by including stronger statements of its position on issues. Under the present system, China need only buy off or else threaten one or more states to prevent ASEAN behaving more boldly to advance its members' key interests. Just as majority verdicts replace the strict requirement for unanimity to prevent the prevalence of hung juries, damaging the institution of trial by jury in many jurisdictions, it could be proposed to ASEAN that it abandon its cherished convention of decision-making by full consensus, perhaps to allow decision-making through agreement by a quorum of 8 or 9 states. Such a change, although momentous, is not prohibited by its charter, which is silent on this issue. Initially, the proposal would be strongly resisted by all members. Over time, and once the seed of the idea is planted, reluctance may well subside. It should be made clear to member states that the inevitable consequence over time of continued paralysis is lessening of emphasis on ASEAN by external powers and several of its own member states. Its diplomatic centrality can only remain if the organization serves to advance the interests of its own members and that of like-minded great powers. On the other hand, if stubborn adherence to unanimous decision-making persists, then its members will be the unchangeable guardians overseeing that organization's demise. Moreover, the reluctance of Southeast Asian nations to endorse the principles of the FOIP on the basis that it would antagonize China and deepen regional competition demonstrates the muddled strategic reasoning which must be confronted. During the Obama administration, these states lamented that the pivot to Asia was not more effective in providing checks against Chinese actions. In the face of ongoing and illegal Chinese advances in disputed areas, these same states are distancing themselves from principles designed to champion their rights and interests. In doing so, China has more and not less incentive to accelerate the consolidation of footholds in the South China Sea, even as ASEAN states blithely demand stability and a reduction of tensions in the region. If considered on its merits, ASEAN and its member states should be comfortable with the principles of the FOIP, as it is a reassertion of a beneficial normative and strategic order which protects the sovereignty and rights of smaller states. The United States and its allies should present a binary choice to ASEAN member states: endorse the principles of the FOIP or those practiced by China. Using the current nomenclature, one either accepts the rules-based order in international law or rejects it. Those choosing to sit on the fence ought to feel the need to justify that decision. The objective is to put the onus on Southeast Asian states to choose between free and repressive visions of world order, which is taking place in the Indo-Pacific, as the NSS puts it. Given that Southeast Asian states are already reluctant to criticize Chinese policies, refusing to choose in this context only helps pave the way for Chinese regional hegemony. Even so, the conversation can be more about carrots rather than sticks. The United States and its allies should seek to persuade Southeast Asian states that it is in their interest to engage formally and substantially with the United States, Japan and Australia with respect to the operationalization of the FOIP concept, even if much of this will be done so behind closed doors. Doing so would signal approval of the basic framework and principles of the FOIP and allow regional states a greater role in shaping the policy agenda for the three FOIP countries. This might include the future direction of the Quad, coming to agreement on an appropriate diplomatic role for ASEAN vis-a-vis the FOIP concept, and common messages with respect to Chinese activities. It would lock in ASEAN as a critical diplomatic entity in a discussion of enduring importance, including discussion of the free and open Indo-Pacific concept on the ASEAN agenda, and the bilateral conversation when member states engage with the United States and its allies. Would also give ASEAN and key states a new and important purpose: assist the three external states to develop more credible and constructive economic diplomacy approaches for the region. Such an economic element is still substantially lacking in the operationalization of the concept. There is also the vexed issue of how China would respond if ASEAN were to collectively engage constructively with the United States, Japan and Australia on the concept. Beijing might well accuse ASEAN of taking sides. The plausible response would be that engaging with a concept which advocates for a rules-based order is not an inherently hostile act against China. It merely proscribes certain behaviors and policies which have been adopted by China. As the self-appointed guardian of regional norms and supporter of international law, ASEAN and other countries are simply using their collective weight to increase diplomatic pressure on countries that violate long-standing rules, practices, and international law. Moreover, it would not serve China's interest to simply walk away from relations with ASEAN, given that Beijing's diplomatic strategy is to find ways to decrease the relevance of the United States in regional disputes. Even China downgrading relations with ASEAN in this context would offer enhanced diplomatic opportunities for the United States, which would be anathema to China's interests. Instead, Beijing should be forced to engage and justify its policies to as wide and public an audience as possible. Finally, forcing a change in Southeast Asia's diplomatic approach is highly complementary to a broader balancing and countering strategy already taking place in Washington, Tokyo and Canberra. The United States, Japan and Australia have established deepening security relations with Singapore, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia and Thailand, undermining the effectiveness of greater security networking between the United States and its allies and partners is regional diplomacy, which has refused to recognize the reality of Chinese actions. Beijing has exploited the lack of criticism against it to minimize costs for itself. Every action and inaction has costs. It is time for Southeast Asian states and ASEAN to think, act and speak consistently and clearly for their own interests, or else court irrelevance and the ruin of their own strategic objectives.